Hey guys, welcome to the BRHS Science National Honor Society tutoring lecture series. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 1, Biology Exploring Life. Okay, so before we delve into the different types of organisms and their properties, it's important that we talk about the different ways to explore life. So there are two different types of data, qualitative and quantitative. So quantitative data is when we create data based on numbers. So if we're quantifying a experiment, we're, for example, counting the amount of bacteria colonies we're seeing on an agar plate. And that would be versus qualitative data using the same example when we would be looking at the types of bacteria on that plate, not necessarily how many there are. So that's qualitative versus quantitative data. Hypothesis is a researcher's um, educated guess about what they're going to expect from an experiment. And then once these hypotheses start to get tested on, researchers will come up with a theory to explain the results that they saw in their experiments. And this whole idea of research, especially relating to biology, is all a cyclical process in the sense that an idea comes about, it gets tested, a theory is made. Oftentimes, that theory is disproven, or if not disproven, sometimes it's altered, and then more tests are done, and the cycle repeats itself. So, once scientists come up with a hypothesis, they design experiments to test them. So in order to test an hypothesis, scientists will do a controlled experiment in which they can control some factors and then see how that affects the outcome. So there are two different types of variables, independent and dependent variables. So independent variables is the variable that a scientist can control. So an example, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side of your screen, an independent variable, for example, would be how much water I give to a plant. And then the dependent variable, which is dependent on the independent variable, is how much that plant grows. So my independent variable, if I give the plant too little water, it likely won't grow much. So the result of the experiment is dependent on whatever you're putting into the experiment, which again the scientist can control. And the reason why scientists choose to control some variables and not others is that they can isolate why something is happening. So if a scientist is just controlling the amount of water that's put in and keeping sunlight even across all of its test specimens, for example, the scientist will be able to tell, okay, I know that this much water will produce this much result, and the likelihood of an outside factor coming in and altering my results would be lower. So now that we've identified how experiments are done, let's look at the 7 different characteristics of life. So the first characteristic of life is order. And order is basically the fact that living cells make up a complex organization. So an example, if you look at the sunflower, which is the first picture, the sunflower illustrates order in the sense that it shows life. Just being life by itself, life must be ordered in order for it to succeed. Our second characteristic is reproduction, and organisms will reproduce of their own kind. So in the next picture you see an elephant, and elephants will create elephant offspring, which will eventually go on to replace the dead parents. The third characteristic is growth and development. So inherited information in the form of DNA will control the patterns of growth and development of all organisms. So if we look at the picture of that crocodile will follow the rules of growth and development encoded in its DNA to grow up to a bigger crocodile. Our fourth characteristic is energy processing. So energy processing is how the energy stored in chemical reactions is going to be used to power organisms. So an example, we look at the caterpillar, which is the fourth picture. That caterpillar is going to use the chemical energy stored in the plant it's eating to power its own activities. That's going to be called a heterotrophic organism because it's eating food instead of making it by itself. Our fifth characteristic is going to be regulation. Um, in biology, you'll find that there are many different types of mechanisms that can regulate an organism's internal environment, but really why it's important is because it keeps the organisms within the limits that can sustain life. So we see the picture of that lizard sunbathing. Um, Lizards sunbathe because they're cold-blooded organisms, but they need to maintain a certain internal body temperature. So that's called homeostasis, which is keeping everything where it's supposed to be. So the lizard goes out in the sun when it needs to warm up, and it will go retreat to the shade when it needs to cool down. Our sixth characteristic is response to the environment. So all organisms respond to environmental stimuli. So then, like a really classic example is the Venus flytrap, because when it senses a fly coming by, for example, it'll close its trap rapidly in response to the fly, which would be the stimulus. So the stimulus is really whatever's going to trigger that response. And then our last characteristic of life is environmental adaptation. So as many of you know, Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, um, adaptations evolve over many generations, and as individuals with traits best suited to their environment have a greater reproductive success, they're going to wind up passing those traits onto their offspring. So then you see the example of the snowy owl. Over time, they've developed sharp talons, which should allow them to capture prey more easily, and then their feathered feet keep it warm in the cold environment. And that's all due to evolutionary adaptation and natural selection. But what you should really take from the characteristics of life is that all life exhibit all seven of these characteristics. And once they all come together, they'll form a successful organism. So now that we've identified the different characteristics of life, let's look at the hierarchy of life and the levels of organization. So we're going to start from biggest and work our way to smallest. So we're going to start with the biosphere. So the biosphere is all of the environments on Earth that support life. And this includes most land, water, and the lower areas of the atmosphere. Um, and then if we move down to the next level, we're going to have ecosystems. And those consist of all of the organisms living in a particular area, as well as the physical components that organisms will interact with. So these are going to be biotic and abiotic factors. Abiotic being non-living, biotic being living. Moving down again to the next level is a community. And in a community, we're going to find all organisms, but in a specific area, although they don't need to be necessarily of the same species. So in a community, for example, in a wetland ecosystem, you can find alligators, snakes, herons, egrets, and plenty of insects and trees and other plants. Moving down to the next level, we're going to see populations. And populations are all of the individuals of a particular species living in an area. And each of these members are going to be called an organism, and not just an individual living thing. So, like, for example, a population of alligators, one alligator would be the organism. So then, now that we've found the organisms within an organism, most are going to have organ systems. And organ systems such as the circulatory, the nervous system, they're going to consist of tissues. And those tissues are going to be all put together to create a specific function for an organ. So an organ system is made up of organs, and organs are made up of tissues, and all of them work together to perform a specific action. So, for example, in the nervous system, is made up of the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. So those are all going to be different organs within the organ systems, and then each of those are going to be made up of tissues. Moving down one more time, tissues are going to be made up of cells, and those are the fundamental unit of life. And then within cells, unless you're a prokaryote, you're going to have membrane-bound organelles. So an organelle, as I just said, is a membrane-enclosed structure that will perform a specific function within a cell. So like a great way to remember this is everyone knows mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. That's an example of a membrane-bound organelle that produces energy for the cell. And then finally, our lowest level before atoms is going to be molecules. So molecules are going to be clusters of atoms, and atoms are going to be the smallest unit, structural unit that make up life. So atoms we know to be all in the periodic table, and we'll get into that when we go into chapters 2 and 3. But these atoms that make up the molecules, they're going to be really important in how we regulate different things and how we move nutrients throughout an organism. So it's important to think about when we're looking at the levels of organization and hierarchy as we move up from molecule to organelle to cell, tissue, organ system, organism, population, community, ecosystem, finally biosphere. On each level, we have something called emergent properties. So, like the famous saying, the whole is greater than its parts comes in here because each level is like a building block. You can imagine it like a pyramid. You need molecules to make up organelles. You need molecules and organelles to make up cells. So as we move up in the ladder of the hierarchy, we're going to have emergent properties that are going to have help support the next level. So another thing I want to touch on this slide is the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So prokaryotic cells um, were likely the first to evolve and were Earth's sole inhabitants about 1.5 billion years ago. And prokaryotic cells are going to have no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles, and they're just going to have the DNA clumped in a region in the cell, and they're just gonna the only real structures in the prokaryotes are going to be the DNA and then the membrane that encloses everything inside the prokaryotes. And this is in contrast to the eukaryotic cells, which evolved from the prokaryotes. But the difference really is eukaryotes are going to have membrane-bound organelles. They're going to have a membrane-enclosed nucleus, and that nucleus is going to hold the DNA. And then we're going to see these two cells are going to be in two different types of organisms. So eukaryotic cells you're going to find in many plants and animals, and prokaryotic cells are often bacteria. And you could have some protists that are prokaryotes. So it really depends. These different types of cells have different functions, and that's going to go to our next part. Structure denotes function. That's really a core idea of biology. The structure of a cell, the structure of an organism, the structure of a limb, for example, fits its function. So, like a really good example is a human hand. A human hand's function is reliant on its structure. For example, the human thumb, the opposable thumb, that's a structure of our hands and that allows us to do so many things like pick up your phone, pick up a glass of water. So without that thumb, without that structure, the function of the hand would be much different. That goes with many different ideas in biology that we'll look through throughout the year. So the next really important idea we're going to look at is how organisms interact with their environment. So organisms are biotic in nature because they're living, like humans are an example of a biotic organism, but then like abiotic would be a rock, for example. Rocks are obviously non-living. So in an ecosystem, you'll have biotic and abiotic factors that are both going to affect how an organisms live. And a lot of that's going to, over evolutionary time, affect what traits are adapted, for example. So in an ecosystem, there's going to be two major processes. So it's really important that you know that matter is going to cycle through an ecosystem, while energy is more linear. So energy is going to come in one end and then go out the next. Although we're going to follow the laws of thermodynamics, which says that no matter can be created or destroyed. Same goes with energy. Energy is going to be gained and then it's going to be lost to the surrounding environment. So a great example is in plants. For example, plants undergo photosynthesis. They're going to absorb the light energy and then they're going to cycle nutrients, and some of that energy is going to be given off as heat to the environment. However, the nutrients that the plant makes, so in the plant's case it would be glucose, those compounds are going to be cycled through an ecosystem in the form of chemical energy. So once the plant uses up that energy, and let's say that plant dies, that plant is going to be decomposed by fungus or other microorganisms in the soil, and the matter is going to be recycled. So there's going to be a recycling of matter, but a gain and loss of energy. So the next idea we're going to look at is evolution. So DNA is a universal genetic code, so among all organisms. And what that tells us is that the structure of DNA evolved very early in evolutionary history. So the first organisms must have had a way to pass on their information to the next generation, and that goes back to our to the different properties of life. If you remember, our our second property was reproduction, and that all has to do with genes and DNA and genomes. So going from number 3 on your slide, genome. So genomes is made up of all of the genes in an organism. So the human genome involves all of our 23 pairs of chromosomes um, from our mom and dad, so 46 total in each of our cells. And those genomes are going to be made up of genes, and genes are going to then be made up of DNA. So DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, those are going to be your A's, your T's, your G's, and your C's, and they're going to be bonded differently so that your organism has the code to make proteins. The proteins are going to make up different structures in cells, and those cells, as we talked about before, are going to make up the organism and the organ systems. And all of those things, if we connect back to the hierarchy, your DNA ultimately is going to control the production of proteins, and those proteins are going to create organelles. Those organelles are going to build up the cells the tissues, the organ, and so on and so forth. So the DNA as a universal genetic code amongst all organisms is going to be really crucial in how organisms are going to survive and pass on to their posterity, their children. So there are 3 different domains. You have domain bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So the domain eukarya is going to have all of the eukaryotes. So eukaryotes can include protists, and as we talked about before, eukaryotes have your membrane-bound organelles, but under the domain of eukarya, they're broken down into plantae, fungi, and then animals. So obviously you know the difference between plants and animals, and then fungi are like mushrooms, and they're like a really diverse group that are decomposed the remains of the dead. Sorry about that. So those are going to make up the domain eukarya. The domain archaea and bacteria are both going to be composed of prokaryotes. So remember, those are not going to have any membrane-bound organelles. And archaea, what makes them distinct is the fact that they're going to live in really harsh environments. So a great example of an archaea bacteria, for example, is an organism in the archaea domain might live in in Yellowstone geysers. So Yellowstone geysers are going to be really hot, and organisms need to be adapted to live in those environments. So archaea might live in high salt concentrations, might live in very low salt concentrations, or pH or temperature, anything like that. So then the last domain we're going to look at is the domain bacteria, and that's also going to be made up of prokaryotic cells. And bacteria really are going to be probably the second most well known, next to eukarya, because bacteria are living all over us. If anyone ever tells you alone, you can always tell them that you're living with hundreds of thousands of bacteria all over you. Bacteria are a normal part of humans and and other organisms. For example, the bacteria in our gut are really important in helping to break down substances and help us with digestion. But bacteria are going to be prokaryotic cells, and they're going to be the most diverse and widespread prokaryotes. Um, and they're going to be really important in different types of relationships with organisms because while they can be helpful, they can also be harmful. So going back to when we talked about regulation, it's really important that an organism be able to regulate how many bacteria it has, because if they get too out of hand, for example, if you're immunosuppressed after a organ transplant, for example, the bacteria aren't going to be stopped from growing, and they're going to rapidly expand, and then you're going to get sick, for example. So now that we've talked about like genes, DNA, and genomes, let's talk about like how those are applied in organisms. So evolution, as defined by Charles Darwin um, in his book about natural selection, he identified four different parts to the idea of natural selection: variation, overproduction, unequal reproductive success, and accumulation of favorable traits. So taking those one by one, variation in genetics is going to be the wide array of organisms. If you look in humans, for example, no two humans really are exactly alike unless they're identical twins, in which case they have the exact same genome. Um, Variation is going to occur through natural selection because um, environmental factors, may be a population split in half after an earthquake or something of that sort. And those two populations are going to evolve distinctly, and that's going to vary the traits in those populations. Overproduction is going to be when the organisms are, as it's said in the definition, overproduced. So when we look at that, let's say, for example, a natural predator has disappeared from an ecosystem, and a species overproduces. That species eventually is going to be cut down. So let's look in the example that's shown here. If those crows were to suddenly disappear, those beetles would reproduce quite a bit because they have no natural predators at this point. And then that overproduction obviously is going to cause, again, variation in the genetics. But then once those crows are reintroduced, those numbers are going to be cut down. So C and D kind of go hand in hand in the sense that um, accumulation of favorable traits is due to unequal reproductive success. So using a different example, let's say you have 100 bacteria on a plate, and you introduce an antibiotic that kills 90 of those 100 bacteria. So you're left with 10. Those 10 bacteria obviously have a trait that helps them survive, that helps them fight against the antibiotic. So those 10 bacteria are then going to pass on their DNA with that favorable trait to their offspring, and then you're going to accumulate more and more of those resistant strains. So that's going to have to do with the accumulation of favorable traits, but unequal reproductive success is the idea that when organisms try to procreate and pass their genetic information on, not not in all cases are they going to reproduce with the same level of success. And this is just going to add another facet into the idea of variation. Because if there's unequal reproductive success, maybe a few traits aren't going to get passed on and another trait will take its place. Or maybe in a different population, that trait does get passed on, but the other one is hidden. And that's going to produce variation in a population and among a species. And then just going back to that idea of overproduction, in species such as fish, if we were talking about reproductive success as well, fish produce thousands and thousands of eggs, but only a fraction of those actually get born and go on to live lives where they can one day reproduce. So by overproducing, the gene pool of all of those thousands of eggs is cut down. So sometimes by random chance, usually by random chance, let's say the 1/10 of the eggs that survive, just for an example, that 1/10 is going to have a unique and varied genetic code. So that all these ideas of overproduction, unequal reproductive success, accumulation of favorable traits, and variation, all of those are going to wind up working hand in hand. Because if I have a fish that produces 1,000 eggs, 100 of which survive, and then let's say 10 of which go on to reproduce, those 10 are going to have the best traits. So those favorable traits are then, through natural selection again, going to lead to a variation in the population. It's going to be a cyclic pathway in which organisms continually can evolve and adapt and change their environment. And then one last thing before we move on is the genetic reasons for variation not only are environmental factors, maybe population gets cut down and a certain gene happens to proliferate, but as you'll learn later in chapter 8, variation occurs because inside of genomes you have genes, and those genes located on chromosomes can sometimes switch places, called crossing over, and the DNA can sometimes maybe have a mutation. That's going to lead to variation. There are a lot of different biological reasons why variation occurs, and we'll go through that later on in the year. So a lot of times, students, including myself, wonder, why is what I'm learning important? And biology is really one of those subjects that are really important and do have practical applications. Biology, technology, and society are all connected. Oftentimes through the process of biotechnology. So a really great example that most of you will know is GMO technology, genetically modified organisms. So right now, scientists and labs across the world are producing seeds of plants that are resistant to drought, resistant to certain types of bacteria and fungus that could wipe out a whole plantation's worth of corn, for example. So humans, in this sense, are artificially selecting which traits they want to pass on. So while this benefits us in some ways, there are also unintentional side effects on evolution because nature isn't being allowed to take its course, isn't allowing these organisms to choose which traits are going to be best in the long term. So while this is all connected, biology, technology, society, and how we are altering our environment, we have to be careful, and that comes into the idea of bioethics, of how we use the wealth of technology that we have in a responsible manner that benefits both us and the environment. So that's going to be the conclusion of Chapter 1, Biology Exploring Life. In our next chapter, which is going to be chapter 34, we're going to look at the biosphere, and how the environment can affect the types of organisms that we have in them, and then we'll connect that back to later on the genetic basis of inheritance. So I hope this video helped. If you have any questions, don't forget you can always email us at brhssciencehonors@gmail.com or join our Google Classroom with the code below.